Hey y'all, welcome to the studio. So we're going to talk about greens today, and I'm going to hop out of the camera in just a second and lower it down so you can see the palette that I'm going to be working on. But I want to talk a little bit about both using greens out of the tube without doing too much to them, modifying the greens that are in the tube, and about how to mix some of those greens that I've seen people using in the Facebook group and in their paintings. So I'm a minute or two early, but I wanted to hop on so that everybody could find the post to log on to. So hang tight, we'll start in about a minute. I'm going to adjust the camera so that it looks down towards the palette and give everybody a chance to join in with us. So thanks for being here today. Gonna have to turn it, and I've got it on the tripod so I won't make everybody nauseous and dizzy. I'm gonna tilt it right on down so that hopefully y'all can get a good view without my arm getting in the way too much. There we go. I think that gets almost the full thing. So, all technical difficulties aside, I hope that we're going to be able to cover some ground pretty quickly today. I'm going to take about 15 minutes to do this, and hopefully the sun is not going to be shining in too much. May need to adjust that. It is summertime light here already. Yeah, I think that's going to make it a little bit less intense. I've got big windows, and they sometimes really kill with reflective light. So, cool. It's showing up. I want to talk first about 3 things. When you are using greens in particular, but really when we're talking about any colors, you want to make sure that you're using variation in value, variation in intensity, and variation in temperature. So you're going to want to have a high, middle, and low in each of those areas. So when you're mixing or when you're using them out of the tube, try to make sure that you've got something that's light, medium, and dark, bright, medium, and dull, warm, medium, and cool. So those are the main 3 different areas that you can make variations in. You don't have to use them all at once. If you think back to our color module, the first one, the easiest one to deal with, is value. So hang tight to that one for a while until you feel comfortable. Then move on to working more with intensity and then temperature to get some more of those subtle color changes. Now, what you're seeing right here, and I think it's, let me scoot these down just a little bit. The camera on Facebook kind of shows in reverse a mirror image of what is actually laying down there, which throws me off a little bit. But what you're seeing here are some of the greens that I keep in the studio. 1 or 2 that I don't use anymore very much, but most of them are ones that I do use, but I modify them in some way. So your first choice with greens is just to get a good assortment of them in tubes and not to worry too much about mixing. So some of them that I use are Cinnabar Green Light. This is the Cinnabar Green Light, and Williamsburg really conveniently adds a sample of the color on the label so that you can see how super intense it is and how very, very light it is. Another green that I use a lot, and well, I use, but not a whole lot. I tend to use it in the spring and summer, very little in the winter and fall, and when I do use it, I use it in real strong moderation because it's super, super intense. It's Permanent Green, and the Williamsburg Permanent Green comes out of the tube almost as intense but a little warmer than a phthalo green. So that gives you a view of what it looks like. Very, very intense. So it's a good one to have handy, but again, using it straight out of the tube can be a little intimidating. The next one, intensity-wise, is, I say ugh because I haven't opened that lid in a long while, and so there's nasty stuff on there, is Phthalo Green. I hardly ever use Phthalo Green because it is super intense and to me feels very artificial. This is a tube from Daniel Smith. It's good paint, but it's just not a color I use very often because it is super saturated, just like Phthalo Blue. Has to be modified a lot to use it and have it look like it belongs in the actual landscape. I think it's problematic to use straight out of the tube, whether you're working abstractly with figures, landscape, or still life. Useful to have maybe, but really needs to be modified. I would not advise using it straight out of the tube. I'm going to have to clean that off before I put that lid back on. Next one down here is, and I should have opened this up ahead of time, is Chromium Green. It's chromium oxide, and it's a fairly warm, kind of earthy green. From brand to brand, it can vary a little bit. I had a tube of it in Blocks, which is another really good brand of paint, that was really much closer to permanent green than it was to the green oxide, the chromium oxide that you see here. But it's more of an earthy green and can be really useful even straight out of the tube. My standby that I use literally all the time is Italian Terra Verde. And this is Williamsburg's earth green that comes from a clay mineral, literally does come from Italy. And it's a fairly intense green that I use as the basis for a lot of the greens that I mix. Another green that you can buy in the tube, but I'm going to show you how to make it. It's one that I was suggesting to somebody else in the group. And clean this off and you'll actually get to see a little bit of what it looks like. It's so dark and transparent that it just looks black when it's in the tube, and it's not. It's a fairly cool green, and it's called Corbae Green. It's really similar to Hooker's Green. It's a real deep blue green. I'm going to squeeze some of these out in a minute and you'll see what they look like. I bought it just to play with, but when they first brought it into the art supply store where I get it. But I've mixed this color for years from a variety of different combinations. So I'll show you how to make some of that as well. It's nice to have if you know that kind of color is going to be one you're going to see in the landscape if you're out there. But I really wouldn't buy it in the tube because it's so easy to make. The last one that I keep around and use with regularity might not look like a green to start with. So when you look at the color on here, it looks like a darker yellow ochre, but it actually is a green. It's a green ochre, Italian green ochre. So it looks really brown when it's next to bright intense greens, but it really does read as a nice warm green in the winter landscape, like the color of the grasses as they've dried out. You can also use it really simply to modify other greens, so it's a really useful tool. I use it as a darker yellow ochre, but I go through it a lot, almost as much as the Italian Terra Verde. It's one of my favorite colors. I actually think I use it more than yellow ochre in some ways. But it's not as useful in mixing a wider range as yellow ochre is. So these are the greens in the tube. And I'm going to squeeze some of these out up here at the top so you can see. And there is the Cinnabar green light. The permanent green. I always think of that as being the color of ryegrass. Chrome Green, and you can see that value-wise it's almost the same as the permanent green, but it's just not as intense. Then next down, value-wise, it's just a little bit darker, is the Italian Terra Verde. Darker, I'm going to make a mess with that yet. Darker and more transparent. Ancient Paint is this Phthalo Green. And hoping I can see comments. I think I can see when y'all comment. I have it up on my computer screen. I don't have that system completely worked out yet. But you can see how intense and blue-green the Phthalo Green is. And here is the Corbett Green. Smear some of that out a little bit. And you can see how dark a green it is. It's almost black. Then the Italian Green Ochre is a really warm kind of reddish green, kind of an earthy green. So those are the ones that come straight out of the tube. If I'm going to use some of those in painting, dripped oil here. If I'm going to use some of those in painting, I'm going to modify them. I'm almost never going to use them. Now I'm back. I don't know why I lost the connection for a second, but I'm back. Yay. If I do hop off, it will be inadvertently. For some reason it dropped the connection, but it picked it right back up. It should hop right back on. I can edit this out later for when I post it in the group. So when you use those super intense greens, modify them a little bit so that they're not so bright, because they'll look super artificial if you don't do that. They're great convenience colors, but you want to play with them a little bit. So if you're going to modify some of those, some of my favorite colors to modify them with are things like Montserrat Orange, which is a close complement, or Yellow Ochre, or the Green Ochre itself. You can tell that Yellow Ochre's been sitting a while. It's got some oil running off of it. So if I take a little bit of that Cinnabar green light, I'm going to try to get it down here where it's closer to the middle so that you can see it. Here's some Cinnabar green light. Get 2 piles of it. One of the colors that works super, super well to mix for grasses or to tone it down is to take some of that pink, that coral color, and mix it in with that bright, bright, intense green. And it'll take the edge off of it. It will still look intense next to other colors, particularly next to an earth color, but it's not going to look so neon-y green or so super intense. So I will frequently use that to knock the edge off of that green just a little bit. You can also use a little ochre. In this case, I'm going to take a little bit of the green ochre and do the same thing. So there's almost always more than one way to achieve the same goal. This is going to look almost the same, not quite, but I could add a little bit more of that green ochre and it would look nearly the same. So again, it just takes the edge off of the green. You'd want to do the same thing if you're using the permanent green. Take a little bit of that. Then I would either add some Terra Verde to it, which is not going to knock off the intensity that much, but it's going to stretch it out. It's almost like an extender. And it'll keep it from being quite so screaming green. It's kind of a Kelly green straight out. So knock that edge off just a little bit. To make something, first before I go that way and go over here to the phthalo. Okay, phthalo green is like phthalo blue. It's a strong dye color. It gets everywhere. You can see how blue-green it is. That can be really useful in a painting if you need like a highlight that is cool. So if you mix a little white in it, because it's a dye color, it's going to actually intensify it. You add a little bit more white and it'll begin to dull it just a hair. So when I add the white to it, it becomes a turquoise. In fact, if I compare that to the turquoise that you can get from Williamsburg, it's almost identical. So that to me is about the main use for the phthalo green, is to make a turquoise. And then that can become a cool highlight for your grasses, but save our eyeballs and don't use it straight out of the tube. Mix it to get other things. The Corbett Green, whether it's out of the tube or mixed, is one of my favorite dark greens. It is almost pure green, but it's really dark. So you can buy it already mixed like that, or you can mix it yourself. And I kind of stumbled years ago on a combination that works to make it. And you make it with phthalo blue and burnt umber. And that's all it takes. You can make it more blue-green with more phthalo, more warm green with more umber. Okay, as with mixing so many colors, you want to start with the color that's not the super intense. So I'm going to start with the umber. You can see that it's almost the same value as that Corbae Green. Then I'm going to take not a whole lot of phthalo. I'm going to mix it a little bit at a time. And it almost immediately greens up. So you see how little phthalo it took to make a pretty rich green. I actually think it's a richer green than the Corbae out of the tube. Okay, that's pretty green. If you're from South Carolina, we have a traditional color here that we use called Charleston Green. And it's a black green, and that's almost that color. So you can get the same thing by mixing yellow and black, actually. So if I took some of that and added more phthalo to it, it's going to become really blue-green. And this is the color that I was suggesting for some of those forests in the Northeast, and even some in South Carolina or the Southeast. When you have those evergreens, they stay green all year round, and they are a very, very different green than, say, an oak tree or a maple. It's going to be a much deeper, bluer green, maybe something in between. This is real blue-green. In between this and this, so you'd want to kind of mix those together. But I would use, when you're dealing with those darker conifers in the summertime, or the spring for that matter, mix your own green for that and make it more of a blue-green. So you'd want to, that would be for the darker darks. Now for the light, where the light hits that, it's going to warm up pretty fast. So if that were going to be my darkest dark, I might actually use the Terra Vert without changing it at all. Let's look at how those look next to each other. And then I probably would take Terra Vert and I would add some ochre to it to warm it up and lighten it up without making it too intense. Because conifer needles, when they get struck by the light, are really warm and golden colored, whether it's winter, spring, or summer. So those are three colors that I would use for something like that, depending again on the lighting situation. You can mix most of these greens yourself. You don't have to use them out of the tube. I think it's always good to know how to mix them yourself. It can be really convenient to have them in the tube already. It can also be expensive, so if you're not ready to make that investment yet, you can get all of those all on your own. So if you wanted to mix Cinnabar Green Light yourself, it is a combination of some of those colors that we have on our supply list. It just takes a few minutes to mix it. So start off, it's going to be Indian yellow, and I'm going to put a tiny little bit of white into the Indian yellow. Remember, Indian yellow is a dye color. And I want to brighten it up and lighten it up. I want it to become opaque. So now after I've added a little bit of white to it, it's about the color of cadmium yellow deep. So it's super intense. It needs a little bit more light. If I take this and hold it next to the Cinnabar Green Light, you can see that it's a little actually darker than the Cinnabar. So I need to go a little lighter. Not a whole lot, just a little bit. So I'm going to adjust for the value first. That's about it. And then I need to make it green. So I want to experiment a little bit. I'll show you what happens if I'm going to start adding Ultramarine Blue to it, or if I add the Phthalo Blue. I need to grab my Ultramarine. Thought I had it out, and I didn't. I had the purpley one out. As you can tell, I'm going to be doing a painting that has lots of greens in it, which is fine this time of year. We've got lots of greens. So in that first one, I'm going to start adding some Ultramarine Blue. And I'm going to go really slowly on adding the blue, because if I go too fast, it's going to darken it too much. And I think you'll see that the Ultramarine Blue is going to make it a little duller, closer to one of those that I mixed. So it's kind of like Cinnabar Green with the edge taken off. And that is because the Ultramarine Blue has that tiny little reddish tint to it. So it's not going to make as intense a yellow-green. So there it is with the Ultramarine. And I am taking, I don't know if the camera can really pick that up, the teeniest little bit of Phthalo Blue, because remember, it explodes into corners. It's not going to take much to really turn the Indian yellow green. And mix. I'm going to have to add a little bit of white to it. It's still a little bit too dark to match Williamsburg Cinnabar. Again, remember, different brands will have slight variations in their colors. Okay, that's got all the blue mixed into it. So Phthalo goes everywhere. It's almost impossible to mix it completely up. So I need a little bit more white. And then I'm going to need a little bit more yellow. Not much, just a little bit. It's getting close to the right value. It's about the right value, but not quite the right intensity. So make it more intense. Add some of that yellow in. And it begins to be a little closer to the Cinnabar Green that Williamsburg produces. Still a little too blue. So you can get pretty close by mixing it on your own. And in some ways you get a more usable color right away. So there's a light yellow green. You can also get great greens by mixing with the neutrals in with the blues. So this was the umber mixed with the blue. If I take yellow ochre and mix with ultramarine blue first, you can get a great green that is almost terre verte. So if you want to try to mix your own terre verte, you're going to take yellow ochre and add ultramarine blue to it. If I add phthalo, because phthalo is much more of a dye color and intense than ultramarine blue, so I'm going to take much to make a pretty intense green, and it's pretty close to chrome green. I could diddle around with it and get it to be almost exactly the same. To make something that is more of a pure green, you're going to want Indian yellow with a little bit of white in it. If you have Hansa yellow, it's almost the same thing. Actually is the same pigment. And a little phthalo. But for the believable greens that look more like what you see in the landscape, I would make sure that you're using or incorporating ultramarine blue in there, or some of the neutral ochre colors, earth colors. It still needs a little bit more yellow, or too much white. Yeah, I'm being really chintzy there with my color. Mainly because I don't want to run out of space. So you can get a more intense, almost pure green by mixing those two together. So when you look at those, you can see that you have variations in intensity, variations in values, variations in temperature. So if I compare greens to each other, I can make a light green, like the phthalo and white right here, the phthalo green and white, that is almost the same value as the more yellow green. But they're going to have a strong contrast because of their difference in temperature. They're both fairly intense, but because of the difference in temperature, they're going to be pushed further apart visually. So I think it's really useful to put out lots of greens, try mixing lots of greens, write down what you're using to mix them as you're mixing, because you will not remember within 10 minutes what you did, and then you'll get frustrated by not being able to duplicate it again. And think about making your use of greens a little bit more complex. Now the same could be said of any of the other colors as well. It's just that green is the one that cries out more for a little bit more complexity rather than that straight out of the tube thing. So test them out, try them a little bit, see what happens with them, and see which ones you end up preferring. And let us know in the comments or in the Facebook group if you have any questions. I think I can scroll, you see my hand coming up, and see if anybody has any questions. And I think I just see people's names. So if you have any other questions about greens, just let me know in the Facebook group, and I hope that's been useful for you. And I'll get this edited and into the course site probably later tonight. And looking forward to talking to y'all tomorrow on the regular Q&A through the webinar software. So take care and happy painting.